Keith Smith, Yahoo Sports, joins us each and every week here on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. He's kind enough to shuffle around as we came on late because of the Ohio State game, taking about 10 million years to end because of fouls going on at the end of the game. But Keith is still good enough to come on with us to get into more of the NBA. Sixers back in action tonight, 8 o'clock on 97.3 ESPN. Keith, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Josh.
I appreciate you jumping on. And one of the reasons why I'm glad to talk to you is because, I look around the league, right? And we see a lot of names out there being rumored for a lot of teams. And the Sixers obviously are one of those teams that is being talked about. And I got to ask you, Keith, we've heard like 10, 15 names, but how many of those names are legitimate? How many guys are legitimately options for the Sixers? Because obviously they can't get all of those guys.
Yeah, that's the challenge. Is it's still a little bit more of a seller's market than a buyer's market. There are very few teams that are still in there saying, hey, we're willing to move on from these guys. You've got Minnesota has sent those signals, but they're not. Look, they don't have a lot of guys that are looking to move. Houston very much has guys they're open to talking about. Sacramento is in that position, but only just recently. And then in the East, Cleveland's got a couple guys, and Detroit's got a couple guys, and then the Thunder have their veteran players that they're looking to move off of. Other than that, everybody else is basically saying, hey, we're making a run at this play-in tournament. We'll figure it out. We'll get into the playoffs one way or another and those kind of things. So that's been a little bit of the challenge, is really identifying which teams are ready to move. There'll be more over the next 2 weeks as we head in. A couple teams, more teams, they'll have a bad couple weeks here and then they'll be ready to sell. But for right now, they're driving high prices because there's so few players actually available.
Of the teams that you think are most likely to be among the sellers, who are those teams? Because, for example, people keep talking about the Pistons, but the Pistons don't seem like they're like rapid fire ready to just sell off. A team like the Rockets, I know Oladipo's name is out there a lot. The Thunder, I feel like George Hill is a rumor for every single team in the league. So which of the teams that are at the bottom of the standings are actually legitimate sellers?
Yeah, the Pistons are open to moving a handful of their guys, as we saw already with Derrick Rose when they traded him. But everybody's kind of talking about Jeremy Grant and that he's not on the table. They're not going to trade Jeremy Grant. Beyond that, it's Wayne Ellington and maybe Mason Plumlee if they found the right kind of deal. Other teams that are known to have players out there on the market: Oklahoma City, Al Horford, George Hill, as you mentioned, and Trevor Ariza. All three of those guys are available for different prices. It's more likely Ariza and Hill move than Horford because of their contract status. Houston is, after Victor Oladipo turned down their extension offer and made it pretty clear he's not going back to the Rockets as a free agent, they're now open to moving him. They're open to moving Eric Gordon if they can find the right kind of trade for Gordon as well. And then PJ Tucker is drawing significant interest. From the Sacramento Kings, Harrison Barnes and Nemanja Bjelica are two guys that a lot of teams are looking at and starting to see. Sacramento had held off until just recently, basically saying, hey, we still think we can turn this around and make a run at the play-in and ultimately the playoffs. Now it seems like they're a little more open to moving a handful of their guys. We know Andre Drummond's on the market, Otto Porter Jr., but those guys have such big contracts, it's unlikely that either one of them will move. So we're in a position where we know there's a lot of guys out there. LaMarcus Aldridge, another one from the Spurs. It's all about finding those right matches. In some cases, much like what happened with Blake Griffin, teams are saying we're not going to send everything it'll take to match salary when we can just wait and sign this guy as a free agent after you buy him out.
Keith Smith joining us here on the Boardwalk on the Hotline here on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. I'm Josh Hennig filling in for Mike Gill at Keith Smith NBA on Twitter for all your NBA coverage throughout the year. Keith, most people believe that it is the Nets. They are the favorite in the Eastern Conference. I don't know if anybody really disagrees with that. But I think the disagreement is, what is the gap between them and the other teams like the Sixers, the Bucks, and others? And can those other teams make a move or two to close that gap?
Yeah, as we talked 2 weeks out from the deadline, the gap's not all that large because the Nets simply don't play any defense. And unless they get some guys who will really step up and start playing defense, then I think that would really start to change that. It's fair, I think, to call the Nets the favorites in the conference. Any team with Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and James Harden probably should be, considered the favorites to at least win their conference. And then they've got good role players. But unless they can find a couple more defenders, teams like Milwaukee, Philadelphia, even Boston feel like, in Miami as well, I should put in there. They feel like, hey, get us in a series with those guys. We can do enough to make them uncomfortable on the offensive end, and we know we can score on them. And that's where those teams, they're not really afraid. But let's see what Sean Marks does to fill out that roster in the next couple weeks, because it could be a very different conversation.
Now, specifically about the Sixers, we know that they've been linked to guys like Kyle Lowry and others. Do any of those guys help the Sixers close that gap? Like, would Kyle Lowry legitimately help the Sixers close that gap? Or is somebody else a better logical option, because we know it's going to take a lot to get Kyle Lowry because of that fat number on his contract?
Yeah, that's the challenge, is how big Kyle Lowry's contract is. Philly cannot make a move very easily to go get him. And I know people have said, well, they could trade Danny Green and Mike Scott and then, maybe, Tyrese Maxey or Matisse Thybulle. And then if they had to, they could put Seth Curry in there. Now all of a sudden you start looking at that and it's like, all right, well, that's two
You
starters.
destroy your entire depth that way, Casey. You lose the entire bench.
Exactly. And that's why you don't do those sort of things. That's why these trades for these guys who make, $25 million or more are so rare in the regular season, unless you take back a significantly big contract in place. If Philly had, somebody who made $20 million that they were willing to move in a trade, now you could start to say, all right, well, you put that together with, a couple other guys and you really get something that makes sense. But once you start talking 4 or 5 players, that's really hard. That's part of the reason Brooklyn's in the position they're in, was because they had to give up so many players to go get James Harden. Now they're going to fill it out, as best they can with, guys on the buyout market and guys who are looking to catch on for the rest of the season. Yeah, Philadelphia could do that too, but you've got a lot of competition from teams that are looking to do that exact same kind of path.
Of course, in the Eastern Conference, the Sixers are technically in the lead right now, 24-12. Nets are 24-13. Bucks are 22-14. Celtics are 19-17. Surprisingly, the Knicks are 19-18. Who would have thought of that? Of the teams in the top 5, how would you rank those teams? Because I feel like people assume the Nets are the best, but the Sixers are currently on the top of the standings. Depending on what day of the week you look at the Celtics, you might determine if they're better than another team or not. So how are you looking at the best teams in the Eastern Conference?
Yeah, I would put the Nets at the top. It's not by a huge margin. Then I would have Philadelphia and Milwaukee. It kind of depends on the day, as 2-3 behind them. And then after that, I do think Boston's going to play better in the second half. Their schedule lightens up considerably. They will get Marcus Smart back. They're going to get him back tonight. He's going to make a huge difference for them on both ends of the floor. They're finally turning the quarter towards better health. They've got a couple more home games than they do road games in the second half. So I do think that that's going to make a pretty big difference for them. And I think that they're going to make a pretty nice run here. But, we'll see. I think really in the East, it is really going to depend on health, who does what they do to flesh out their roster at the trade deadline, and then what happens matchup-wise, because that's going to be what I think ultimately determines who will win the Eastern Conference.
Keith Smith joining us here on the Sports Bash on the Boardwalk on the hotline on 97.3 ESPN at Keith Smith NBA on Twitter. Keith, quick question about the Western Conference. The Jazz are at the top, followed by the Suns, the Lakers, the Clippers, a bunch of the teams all at 24 wins. Are the Jazz a legitimate contender, or are they a paper tiger that happens to be at the top of the conference standings?
Yeah, that's been a really popular discussion point. And I think for the Jazz, what my feeling is on them is they are absolutely a contender to make the finals. I don't know that I'd put them above either one of the LA teams, but they're in the mix. If the matchups can fall right for them, and they only have to play one of the 2 LA teams, I think they have a pretty good chance, because I think those 2 teams would really kind of make each other work, beat each other up in a series before they got to Utah. And I think that makes a difference. They also have, even with minimal fans in the stands, the Jazz have one of the true home court advantages in the NBA. So I think that they are very much for real.
Keith Smith, Yahoo Sports, at Keith Smith NBA, Celtics blog, and more, all the NBA coverage over there. Follow him on Twitter again at Keith Smith NBA. Keith, I appreciate you reshuffling around with the schedule. Obviously, college basketball shuffling all of our lives around a little bit. I know you've been watching the games as well, so it's definitely an interesting time of year for the NBA, and it's good to have them finally back in action.
Absolutely. I love this time of year. We've got this and the trade deadline, and then the NBA playoffs will be on top of us. Before we know it, it's a great time for basketball. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Y'all stay safe, you and yours.